As part of my ongoing research and raising awareness of stuff, I continue to talk regularly about embalmer's clots. The reason for that is quite simple. It's almost like stocks and shares. I know that this is going to be a serious issue at some point that can't be ignored. And so, because I am aware of what's going on in the background and the science that is happening, I'm able to continually touch and make reference to this topic because it's a matter of time before it explodes. One of the questions history is going to ask us is how in the world could something so strange be occurring, being noted by embalmers, a profession in and of itself that the scientific community has largely completely ignored? It's incredible. However, this is part of that ongoing series of reflecting on the science. And because I have the privilege of getting scientists all over the world, they send me stuff, analysis, and so on. I'm going to give you a few insights from this analysis tied to what they're saying, what I look at clinically in my research, and what I'm understanding, even from what Garrett had said in the past. So I'm sharing with you an idea, and you have to understand it is a hypothesis. This is not factual, but it's tied into the premise of extrapolation of science. I don't need to wait for something to happen to know that it is going to happen. If you extrapolate the science, you can realize this is relevant. So here is what was sent to me recently, a comprehensive mini review on amyloidogenesis of different SARS-CoV-2 proteins. And the author of this has been with me in the past, and he looked at this article from 2022, where they were looking at different parts of the SARS-CoV-2 virus and proteins in it that can have amyloid impacts. And so he was using this to strongly support the conclusion that multiple SARS-CoV-2 proteins, not just a spike, possess intrinsic amyloidogenic potential. And I'm going to come back because you may not understand what it means about amyloid. So I'm capturing some thoughts. I'll come back to it. The main ones are spike protein, we know, but they also noted the nucleocapsid protein can do it and the envelope protein can do it as well. But mainly the spike protein. And this whole pattern is what I'm now trying to tie together. So again, I'll explain this is hypothetical based on an extrapolation of the science and an integration of a number of lines of thinking. I had recently done a presentation on the future in terms of the amyloid prediction, prion diseases, and this is very closely tied to amyloid and amyloidosis. So I'll go into that in just a second, but just a reminder in the description below is coming up for us COVID's hidden time bomb, the rapid arterial aging. This is linked to a very important paper that has come out. And in effect, when you do the dissection of the paper, it tells you something very important that even in that COVID negative cohort, there is rapid arterial aging. And my question had been, what percentage were vaccinated? We didn't know because they didn't share it. And so that's an important premise as to what does that mean at population level as we go forward, because it's linked to all kinds of diseases, heart disease, dementia, kidney disease, hypertension. So it's a very important topic. Look in the description below and join us for that journey. So let's get back to a few things in terms of what is going on. So just a quick idea as to what is happening in terms of these embalmer's clots. This is from previous presentations, and I've put a few slides together. Firstly, as I said, these are real. They can't be denied. So this is a picture of Richard Hirschman. He's an embalmer. He's been one of the vocal people talking about it. And this is what it can look like. Now, this is an extremely long one, a fibrous clot, 19-inch clot that he's got in formalin. They're not necessarily as long as this, but they can be certainly as thick or as big, and you usually get them from large arteries or veins. What's important is that it is real. And if you look under it, like Kevin McKernan had done, under the microscope and does do the analysis of the proteins, these are human proteins. It's not made up in a lab. So this is why I said different from many other things that people may think are conspiracy. This is like seeing an alien spacecraft and saying it's not there. This is definitely there. There is something going on that we haven't seen before. And when they had done the analysis of the proteomics, they found that in red, in black, is normal in part of a clot, but in red are all these proteins that can be involved. And some of the most important ones are the hemoglobin subunit beta and alpha. This I did a presentation on recently, which suggests that in order for these clots to form, you have to have some hemolysis of red blood cells. And so that to me suggests this is autoimmune. But that's a separate thing. So when I looked at the clot characteristics, there are a number of things that I thought were intrinsically involved in making these very unusual clots. I did think that the immune system with neutrophils and macrophages were critical. Definitely the spike protein and its links to some other proteins, including heparan sulfate. Platelets, to some degree, can get caught up, but a lot of hemoglobin is usually part of the clots. And this is what had caused me to think that this had to be a relatively acute phenomenon. It wouldn't have been something that just um, was there for a long time. So many people are worried, do I have these growing in me? And I usually reassure people that based on what the science looks like, it looks as though it's a relatively acute occurrence. Now, in order to understand why this could happen in relation to spike protein, you have to understand that there are certain characteristics about the spike protein that increase the risk of these amyloid responses. And you'll see why they're relevant in terms of clot formation. And here you have an example of a spike protein that is being broken up. And what I've shown is inside the spike are sections that have amyloid or prion like characteristics, which largely become exposed when it's being broken up. And so this is part of the reason why it's not necessarily the whole intact spike protein that's the problem, but it's when it's being digested, some of these pieces can become exposed. And part of the question that was existing is that in the context of mRNA spike, because the spike protein is in an open position as opposed to a closed position, which is for a normal spike protein, it may increase the exposure of some of these amyloid pieces. But when we come to the question about amyloids and the context of prion and amyloids are very similar in that they aggregate. And so this is an image just showing you what can happen. And it's using a prion principle, but the same mechanism can occur with amyloids. And so this would be a normal protein. And is that it gets abnormal because these parts of the protein straighten up. They're no longer coiled. And when they shift to this position, they can then stack. And that's technically what an amyloid or prion. The difference with prions is that they are almost infectious. They cause other proteins to become abnormal and stack. And so this is why they're very, very dangerous in terms of the prion. But the premise of the amyloid stacking together and making a very big protein that is very smooth, kind of like what we see with the embalmer's clots, is critical to understanding what is occurring. And the way to look at it is that it's almost like what happens when you use a magnet. And this is the kind of principle where all these proteins suddenly get sticky to each other, and just because the magnet is applying a degree of magnetism, this screw, which wasn't magnetic before, suddenly is, and then it makes this one magnetic, and then this one. And you then have this aggregation here of proteins, because everything just clumps together into a very tightly woven pattern. And that's the premise with regards to the prions and amyloids. Now, the reason this is not so straightforward and very difficult to predict is that in order for it to happen, it seems like about 5 or 6 things need to align. So it doesn't just happen in everyone, it needs a number of things to come together for this to occur. Now, when we look across populations, one of the characteristics, certainly with prions, is the fact that different populations have different risk factors. And there's a specific genetic predisposition they call the genotype, which is about 37% of Europeans, 93 to 98% of East Asians, Africans, much lower number, South Asians, about 55 to 70%, Native Americans, 80 to 90%. But this genetic predisposition increases the risk of prion formation. And in this case, I'm using the term prion and amyloid interchangeably, because I'm talking about the risk of making these very strange, abnormal embalmer's clots. The critical bit in it that I said recently, that again is my hypothesis, is that when I had spoken to the whistleblower who had identified these patterns, his view from a cursory perspective of seeing patients was that almost all of the patients were vaccinated. He said the few people who weren't vaccinated was because we didn't know their vaccination status, not because they weren't. And so that was a red flag, and it made me realize that quite possibly, instead of just being related to the spike protein, there may be some characteristics about the lipid nanoparticle. And this was the embedding of the tin, because there was tin noted in some clots, not all. And so this then suddenly becomes a part of the picture. So it's not focused necessarily on the mRNA. The mRNA will then go on to make a spike protein, which may have amyloid characteristics, but the lipid nanoparticle itself may in some way exacerbate the issue. So that's another piece that needs to be aligned. But that is relevant because although the risk may be highest in terms of East Asians, they primarily used whole virus vaccines. And what it sounds as though is that many of those whole virus vaccines actually didn't have a lot of spike on them because of the way how it was formulated. And so in reality, they still have very broad immune responses. So here is the analysis of pulling all of this together. There needs to be a degree of genetic predisposition. So not everybody would necessarily be affected. 1. 2, it seems that it is more likely to occur in a highly vaccinated population, more connected with mRNA vaccines than whole virus or even probably protein vaccines. That's my thought on it. 3, it needs as the trigger a significant circulation of spike protein. And that's where it ties back to GERT. You have to remember that GERT has been predicting that this Hivicron, it's a highly virulent variant that is going to evade the immune system, as primarily in the vaccinated cohort, because their immune system is still directed a lot to the original variant and the subsequent variants. So when it hits one of those variants that can largely evade the immune system, what you will then have is ongoing viral circulation with lots of spike protein. And this is now where all of it can potentially come together. And now my thought is that instead of it being a rapid respiratory disease, like what happened in the first wave of the pandemic, I don't think it will present like that. Based on this, and this again, let me be clear, is my hypothesis. I don't mind being wrong on this because this is not pretty. But based on this extrapolation of a coming together of a number of things at the same time, you will end up with an immune response triggered by circulating, ongoing circulation of virus with therefore spike protein tied in with immunoglobulins, especially IgG4. This will trigger an autoimmune hemolytic response. So you will get free hemoglobin being connected with this. And then, because the immune system has been activated, these macrophages are creating nets. This will then become the nidus of the amyloid. Now, the way how it works is that part of the reason why we don't see this occurring is because the body has a way of picking these things up and dealing with them and addressing them in one way, shape, or form. When that system becomes overwhelmed, you will then have a nidus, almost like a crystal of clot that will then potentially grow quite rapidly to then form a large clot. That fundamentally is my prediction in the context of what I think is going to happen in the future. And I'm going to take you back, if I can, to the original picture, which is that in order for this to therefore have such a significant impact, what would then occur is multiple large clots like this. And that would be the terminal or the event that makes people very, very unwell. That's, in my view, how all of these lines could come together into one terrible situation where we don't see the typical severe disease, but we see people getting sick very quickly. And if you don't know it's related to clots like that, if they have formed, they will block major arteries and people will just pass away. The only way you will know it is if embalmers are embalming them. So all of the people who have been cremated, we would have no idea. Even if they have just been buried, you would have no idea. The only people who can see this occurring, and this is why I said it is such a scientific failure, are embalmers, because they're the only ones who are flushing out the blood out of a body to then replace it with something else that then preserves it. Nobody else would know. And so, in reality, if up to 80% of embalmers across the world are seeing these patterns, what happens if it starts to occur far more frequently? The concern is that we will just see increased morbidity, increased mortality, and we will not understand why unless we were actively looking for this to try and see if it could make sense. That's the worry, because at this point, we are so far behind the curve of understanding this kind of pathology because there was no interest. Can you believe it? No interest in a pattern of disease that we have never really seen before. History is not going to forgive us for this. Let's hope that somebody in a position of power is listening and willing to do the research that could make a difference. Because maybe if we understand, we can mitigate it. I don't think we can stop it, but if we can mitigate it, that may be enough. Have a good evening.